Hey guys, welcome to the first annual Our Cinema Oscar special. This is Our Cinema. This is not On Cinema. This is Our Cinema. Our Cinema.
Okay, next up in our series of retrospectives, this is an interesting one. Now, I'm a huge fan of what we call so bad it's good. Whether it's a movie that's unintentionally hilarious for its faults or something purposefully designed to replicate those kinds of faults for the sake of comedy. I'd expect a lot of you that follow On Cinema would have similar appreciation for the latter form at least because, well, there's a lot of it in there. That these characters are often hilariously incompetent in what they try so hard to achieve. We see the fruits of the labor that we've heard so much about and laugh at how it turned out. There are many different angles on this and different perspectives on the reasons for various failures. After the Deck of Cards movie, we got a whole half-hour special dedicated to Tim and Gregg arguing about which one of them messed it up. Or the Oscar specials, for example. Tim will blame everyone else for every shortcoming, even if he sometimes will take a brief pause in pointing fingers to apologize for his behavior before reverting right back to his rageaholism and terrible music. But from Gregg's perspective, the Oscar specials don't go well because Tim always makes it about himself and spends too much time on extraneous, irrelevant topics without leaving enough time for what he wants to do. But finally, in 2017, after years of struggle to do things his way, Gregg had his chance to do just that. The result is an Oscar special that makes the previous three look to have the production quality of the actual Oscars. A disaster that will almost certainly test your patience and your sanity.
I had a stomach ache.
But in the end is a refreshingly unique, artfully constructed, wonderfully bizarre, and most importantly really funny hour and 47 minutes of grown men struggling to do basic things that are worthless in the first place. Because with Tim off in Dubai with his electronic music group DKR, Gregg had the opportunity to put up a shitty looking "Oh God, you devil" cutout on the wall and do it his way. Even with plenty of time to cover the Oscars and get into the expertise and analysis that he had so long fought to make time for, hilariously, it was about 1,000,000 times more pointless than the first four.
This has nothing to do with the Oscars.
The Oscar expertise on display is mostly him just very slowly reading lists of old movies and spouting conspiracy theories about the letters that the nominated movies start with.
Last year it was Oscar so white. This year it's Oscar so A through M.
With no knowledge of what's actually happening at the Oscars. At one point, Gregg literally asks for the viewers to call in or tweet at him to tell him who the winners were.
Any other Oscar winners that we can report to our audience? Anybody have that information, want to call in?
Surely the idea for a live stream like this would be to get info on who's winning the Oscars. Obviously the best way to do that is just to either watch the Oscars or look at updates on your phone. But even if you were to for some reason watch this instead to get that information, you won't because Gregg is literally asking you to provide him with that information. Endlessly pointless. This special takes the core of Gregg's unique sense of humor and strips it down to its most bare elements and turns them up to 11. He gets to be as dry and boring and just plain wrong as he wants in his Oscar talk.
This is the #1 Oscar movie of all time, The Hobbit.
When he lists the top 10 Humphrey Bogart roles, he literally just says the title and doesn't elaborate in any way.
Number 10 in the top 10 Humphrey Bogart roles of all time, The African Queen. Okay. Number 9.
And amidst a variety of chaos takes forever to get through it. It's fearless in a way because it's not at all concerned with being entertaining or even watchable, but it ends up being more entertaining than a lot of comedy that's actually trying to be entertaining because it's so endlessly funny that this exists in the way that it does, especially coming from these characters. And Mark fits so perfectly into it because of his comparable talents for making the mundane hilarious. And let me tell you, this is a special treat for Mark heads because still to this date, it's the longest stretch of uninterrupted Mark content we've ever gotten. Without Tim to cut him off, he's so supportive of Gregg's Oscar talk, laughing at his jokes.
Lean McMahon, no relation to Ed McMahon. Richard Farnsworth.
And trying his best to help Gregg provide the Oscar updates they simply don't have.
Mark, can you see if any awards been given yet?
Should I call someone?
Just go.
He even joins in himself, telling us about his favorite films, such as Sneakers, That 70s Show, and Trolls.
I really did, I enjoyed Trolls.
Him coming in and telling his story about how he got a case of pineapple juice for free at Staples is one of my all-time favorite moments.
Funny story about how I got these. I did get these. At Staples.
The way he tells this mundane story as if it's the most fascinating thing that ever happened in his life just kills me.
They were free because if they couldn't scan it, they couldn't find them in their computer.
It goes to illustrate how pathetic this production is, but also to how pathetic his character is because of how proud he is of his contribution. And I love the detail that he leaves this warm case of pineapple juice on his lap for over 10 minutes while the show goes on. Like it's all for him and he wants to show it off. There are little details everywhere in both Mark and Gregg's hilariously dry performances that show just how firmly in these characters they are. Look to Mark responding to Gregg's request for a Billy Crystal impersonation by stating that he needs to look up some facts, which is hilarious insight into his process because of what he knows his impressions to be like.
I died in 1975.
Great character detail, but with Mark being the great character actor he is, he takes it a step further. You can see that he feels awkward for not being able to pull that impression out, so he clumsily imitates the picture of Billy Crystal on the screen to compensate. As a character who's painfully unfunny and is terrible at impressions, and yet whose whole public identity is wrapped up in being a comedian/impersonator, this feels like a window into his inner battle, as he's acutely aware of his shortcomings, yet he just continues to try his damnedest. One would wonder why he wouldn't just hang up his bowler hat at this point and waddle back to the Midwest, but we're glad he doesn't. Or when Gregg, famously stuck in the past in his technological preferences, speculates that the Oscar gift bags would include expensive items such as iPods.
The Oscar gift bags have expensive iPods.
Again, this was in 2017. I love this special for that kind of thing, because it's just these two guys on camera with no actual segments to cut away to. There's so much time to sit with what's happening and appreciate their performances and character work.
Oscar. Okay, well, that's a nice thing about the VHS tape versus the DVDs.
They don't break.
They don't break.
There's so much gold in even the most subtle moments of their behavior. Bonus shout out to Mark getting startled by this balloon.
Balloon's just a little bonus.
But that's just the very tip of this disastrous iceberg. There's a real art to this kind of thing, and as far as I'm concerned, in the entire genre of deliberate, so bad it's good comedy, the Our Cinema Oscar special is the statue of David, the Mona Lisa of purposefully unwatchable unpleasantness. It's a painfully cringy, unsettlingly dark, honest-to-God work of art that deserves a hell of a lot more views than it has. It goes beyond the usual trappings of trying to make something bad ironically. It's elevated into a class of its own by laying a foundation of a very misguided plan, a pathetically lame set, artfully executed technical chaos, and the always incredible comedic instincts of Mark Pork and Gregg Turkington. And from that already pitiful foundation, letting everything possible go spectacularly wrong. Combining their flaccid Oscar coverage with all of these well-timed technical difficulties amounts to this really amazing ballet of terribleness. Pathetic is the word of the day. Every detail of this is just pathetic. Without the usual budget, gone are the graphics and intros and the set design of the typical Oscar special. Instead, we're in a tiny, barely decorated room where two guys share one microphone, eat popcorn straight out of the microwave bag, and give each other plastic Goodwill bags filled with 5-for-1 VHS tapes.
And you can have the actual bag.
The special starts with a shot of a sloppily handwritten title card on a whiteboard. I guess this wasn't supposed to go live yet because Gregg rather unprofessionally just walks in front of it and starts talking to the crew about when Mark will be getting there, and then leaves for a few more minutes of silent camera adjustment. This really sets the tone for what to expect because there are painfully long stretches of nothingness throughout. There's so many long sequences of Mark and Gregg just struggling in silence.
Dead air!
When Gregg first sits down to introduce the idea that the second half of the nominee list must have been lost,
Somebody goofed.
it's immediately clear that the DP from the Blair Witch Project is shooting this thing. Throughout the whole special, the camera is a huge point of focus. It's one of the aesthetic elements that makes this so hilariously unwatchable. Unlike the regular Oscar specials, this is done with one camera. It's all one take and there are no cuts. A one-take masterpiece on the level of films such as 1917 or Victoria, but rather than being a well-orchestrated production, it's designed to be as poorly done as possible. The camera is constantly, and I mean constantly, zooming and panning and falling off of its axis. Sometimes it'll randomly pan up to the ceiling for a while. There's literally a moment when the camera suddenly swings to one side of the set and then violently back to the other, showing a guy on his laptop drinking a beer behind the scenes. The funny thing is that there's nothing about this that should demand a dynamic camera. If they had just set it on a tripod in a wide shot and left it alone, it would have been 100% better. But the camera person, whoever they are, feels the need to actively follow everything that's happening to sickening effect. If Gregg takes something out of his pocket, you can bet they'll readjust the position of the camera to zoom in on his lap and refocus. And it's not just the camera work itself. We often see cords or fingers in front of the lens.
Best director is another one. Best original score.
It's just the most beautifully incompetent production I can think of. Surely a child could do better than this. But the technical insanity goes way further than just the camera work. I wouldn't watch this one in loud headphones because the sound mixing is laughably bad for a production that literally requires 2 vocal mics at a consistent level. Set it and forget it. But no, for some reason whoever's mixing this is constantly riding those faders like he's in DKR or something. The sound is frequently cutting out, clipping, and popping.
Was the Best Supporting Actress nominee.
Listen to this one moment where the sound suddenly goes from quiet to unbearably loud for seemingly no reason.
The number one runner-up. Can you believe that this man has not taken home Oscar Gold? It's none other than
Leo.
Not to mention that for the first half, Mark and Gregg are sharing one mic, leaving one of them talking off mic at all times.
None of these movies go past the letter M.
Yeah, I found that strange.
But it can't just be that. That's not quite hard enough to watch. The lighting is honestly the star of the show here. It can't be overstated how bad it is. It's constantly changing, flickering, suddenly going dark in spots. You would have to have someone dedicated to deliberately messing up the lighting throughout the whole special to achieve this level of obvious ineptitude. And it has a real effect on everything else. The pictures that are such a key piece of the Oscar special tradition, here instead of being overlaid via live stream software, are simply displayed on the TV in the set. As the lighting changes, the pictures have different effects and moods, at times appearing so washed out that they're downright creepy. It affects the performances as well. There are people behind the scenes on this production that, through messing with every aspect of it, are creating the ideal conditions to not only make Gregg and Mark look as stupid as possible, but to give them a uniquely unfavorable environment to have to pull off a show in, and many difficulties to react to, or in Gregg's case, be mostly unfazed by. But it also creates this weird, ominous, maybe a little horror-tinged atmosphere, even before the actually dark stuff comes into play. There are parts of this that genuinely feel like a hostage video. Almost like for some reason, the tiny crew producing this is purposefully sabotaging it and delighting in Gregg and Mark's discomfort.
Can somebody turn that off?
Throughout the special, Gregg desperately pleads to have a break a number of times, and oddly, they won't let him.
Can we have a little break here? I don't know. A little break? Just a short break. Please.
He's genuinely flustered in a way that we normally don't see him. I mean, he's literally begging to stop filming. It's really strange and makes it even more uncomfortable. But it makes sense because there's just so much going wrong at any given time. To bring together all of this, let's just look at this one segment where Gregg is trying to do a tribute to Oscar runner-ups. His plan is to simply list the top 10. Should be easy enough, right? Let's see how they do. He starts setting up the segment, and the camera's already going crazy, and we see Mark losing interest immediately in reading the nutrition info on the can of pineapple juice that he's holding. As Gregg hands his popcorn to Mark, the lights suddenly go off completely. Okay? Gregg holds his composure, but Mark is confused and has to block the light from his eyes. As the lights come back on and continue to flicker and change, Mark drops his case of pineapple juice on the ground. This finally gets Gregg flustered, and for the first time, he asks the producers to let them take a break and clean it up, even though it's obviously an excuse because all they need to do is just pick up this box.
No, we can't? Okay.
The producers tell him no, so Gregg gets back to it. As he sets up the first Oscar runner-up, H.B. Warner, we see a hand go in front of the lens and the camera starts randomly zooming in on nothing and refocusing. At this point, Mark gets distracted and looks over at the TV for some reason. Then Gregg's phone rings and the camera clumsily pans to him and then tilts off its axis as the tripod breaks, and Mark decides to grab his bag of popcorn. After a bunch of confusion, the TV connection craps out and shows the input screen, while the camera's trying to get back to its normal position and Mark is trying to give Gregg his popcorn back. Gregg won't take it, but Mark keeps trying. Then when the TV reconnects, it flies through a million pictures to find the right one, and even when it lands on one, Gregg isn't sure it's correct.
H.B. Warner? Is that H.B. Warner?
Then, once it's finally settled, Mark stops paying attention again and goes on his phone. After some more droning from Gregg, Mark knocks over the easel holding the whiteboard, and Gregg again pleads to take a break.
Please, just cut for just a minute.
After it's set back up, the whiteboard almost immediately falls again. If you watch this moment in particular, it's clear that someone off camera knocked it over. It must have been so fun to work on this shoot and be tasked with just messing with it in different ways like this and watching Mark and Gregg have to improvise their reactions. I love that Gregg comes up with the idea that a dog knocked it over.
You can't have dogs and whatever else loose.
I have to imagine that this was him improvising an explanation after realizing that it may have looked strange that this whiteboard just flew off the stand like a Paranormal Activity movie. Anyways, Gregg again pleads for them to cut. There are those hostage video vibes.
Just cut the feed for a second.
When they finally do cut, the person behind the camera just puts their hand up in front of the lens as the sound cuts in and out. When the hand drops, it's just Mark sitting there and the easel falls for a third time. Then Mark leaves, and we get an empty shot of a popcorn-covered floor and random images of old actors on the screen before it cuts out and goes to the input screen again. Finally, it's almost a full 4 minutes of dead air with Mark silently walking around holding tape and the camera being readjusted many, many more times before they're back in their chairs and the rest of the segment goes off without a hitch. Oh wait, no, because now someone starts moving this lamp around and loudly knocks it over. Okay, you get the point, but the issues just keep on going. But even if the discussion taking place weren't useless,
Ron Howard was in the Arnie Griffith show.
and even if there weren't those pesky poltergeists turning lights on and off and dragging around or knocking over parts of the set during the shoot, there's another little demon of sorts meddling with the show from across the world.
It's Tim Heidecker calling in.
In the season leading up to this special, Tim became so addicted to Dr. Sand's nutritional vaping formula that was full of dangerous chemicals and drugs that he had a breakdown on the show.
I don't want to do this anymore.
It wasn't long before he burned down Gregg's storage unit and severely burned himself in the process, prompting an intervention organized by Joe and attended by the other characters from the show. This ended with Tim essentially doubling down on his behavior and forming DKR due to his injuries preventing him from continuing with Dakar as is.
I'm gonna make a commitment right now. I'm gonna kick it up a notch. We are about to go Dakar 2.0, man. We got a whole new angle.
Stop
Now
you
everybody
from
get the
taking
fuck
all
out!
The season ended with a severely injured Tim, still vaping, still clearly on drugs, and telling Gregg that both Ayaka and Juliana were pregnant, so he would be having 2 more kids.
What's wrong with you?
Side note, was this a dropped thread? I can't remember any resolution to this, but I may have missed something. Anyway, the point is, Tim is an absolute mess leading into this special, and now he's off partying in Dubai. I've always wondered about Tim being able to get a big DJ show like this, because it's played as if we're meant to believe he's actually there playing a show. However, it's obvious Tim is at least exaggerating the scope of his trip, as he tells Gregg that he's on the 65th floor of the Four Seasons in Dubai, and yet I looked it up and that hotel is only 5 stories tall. So if he's exaggerating how high up he is to make his status there seem more important, surely the scope of his DJ show would be exaggerated greatly as well, if he even had one. Especially given the fact that when he's off on this supposedly amazing trip to Dubai, his attention is firmly fixed on what Gregg is doing with the Oscar special, and his prerogative is to make as much of an impact on the show as possible.
Pour me some bubbly now, it's all you gotta do. That's what they want. You're not providing anything for these people.
I love this angle of doing a special where Gregg gets to do his own thing, but still having Tim be a major player in it just from phone calls alone.
Where the fuck do you get it in your head to have Mark Proksch on the show?
It builds really well too, setting up the vibe of the Oscar special with just Gregg, to the calls starting to come in,
He didn't waste any time
No, he didn't.
in meddling with the show.
to him finally getting through and causing a bunch of ridiculous arguments with so many funny moments.
This is a movie show. This isn't a recap of a concert that no one's interested in.
To Tim calling all bummed out and apologizing in that classic unstable Tim way.
Maybe I'm just a little bummed and regretful that I'm not there with you guys. I am in a lot of pain right now.
And finally to him essentially threatening to kill himself and then never being heard from again.
There's a window here. You know what I mean?
Well, jump.
Of course, he didn't actually do it. After the special, he tweeted out updates saying, "Sorry, my phone died, all good," and "I am alive and didn't jump out any window whatsoever," whatever that was about. I like how in the context of everything that's happening in the universe and how drugged out and unstable and unhappy Tim has been, his behavior has been thoroughly set up. And the way I think of it is that Tim is feeling so unhappy and upset that with Gregg doing an Oscar special without him, he feels he needs to ruin the show however he can and make his mark on it.
I don't want this dominating our show.
There was never a concrete answer on what exactly happened, but I like to think that this whole thing was a stunt to get attention and see how everyone would react, while also ruining Gregg's night. After trying to derail the show by calling in over and over, he tries a new tactic, pretend he's in danger and that he might be dead, even hiding out from Axiom, who calls into the show to see if Gregg knows anything. It's yet another example of On Cinema's incredibly creative storytelling, even in a special as inane as this, and leaving it open-ended enough that we can speculate on what exactly is going on. This whole section is when the special turns pretty dark and weird and kind of a harrowing downward spiral. It goes very quickly from a harmless embarrassment with hostage video undertones to a pretty desperate and morbid situation.
Can you go to the front desk of the hotel and ask there if they know where Tim is?
Tell him to look outside, see if there's sirens.
It's also where a lot more of that artistry in the production becomes evident, as the technical chaos becomes far more intentional to represent the dire situation and the feelings of these characters. For example, at the end when Gregg is left alone under the impression that he may have encouraged Tim's suicide.
You may have killed Tim.
The lighting changes again, becoming darker and harsher with ominous shadows of hands reaching over him. The frame becomes more intimate and uncomfortably close to Gregg's face as he copes with what is happening. Even the photos on the screen start getting really morbid, like this one that says "Don't jump on it," or the photo of Heath Ledger that comes up. Jeez. It's oddly powerful and kind of disturbing imagery that's actually enhanced by the poor presentation that made the previous hour-ish so funny. Through all of this business with Tim, we also get a lot of insight into Gregg and Mark's characters and the nature of their relationships with Tim, specifically representing how Tim seems to be the center of Gregg's universe, and Mark having the inverse reactions as someone who doesn't like Tim but also doesn't want him to die. In this way, we see Mark as very much a normal person here.
Hey, Tim.
Sure, he's incredibly awkward and dim and out of place, but Mark is very much being reasonable. Earlier in the special, when Tim is attempting to raid the show, he tells Gregg not to answer because there's no point.
Don't answer it, please. There's no point.
He doesn't feel the need to platform Tim in the hopes of publicly winning an exchange with him. But in Tim and Gregg's fucked up relationship, it's almost like Gregg can't resist the urge to answer, just so that he can win an argument publicly and hang up on him.
I took an opportunity.
Bye-bye.
So what?
Goodbye.
Just as Tim can't resist the urge to call a million times to ruin Gregg's night. That's an insight into the central theme of Tim and Gregg being so closely linked despite their apparent hatred for each other. These two drama queens just can't resist starting shit with each other. Then, when Tim stops calling, Gregg keeps saying that he doesn't care and brushing it off in a really messed up and callous way.
Because if he killed himself, that's his own choice. It's always their own choice. Whether it's Tim or Heath Ledger or whoever it is, it's their own choice.
Even when Axiom calls in, Gregg largely ignores the issue and asks him if he has an Oscar pick, even lashing out about his hatred for DKR when Axiom says no.
Listen, I don't even care about that.
Okay, well, I don't care about your music, so...
He won't let Tim win. Back to movies. But Mark, who didn't want Gregg to answer the phone in the first place, is now really concerned for him, despite announcing that he's leaving in the form of a terrible W.C. Fields impression.
I think I'm gonna go home.
This is the normal reaction for someone that isn't in a mutually abusive relationship with Tim. We know Tim is currently in a period of hating Mark, especially after the intervention.
Mark, you want to say a few words?
I don't have any interest in hearing what he has to say.
Good. Okay.
A great detail on this that makes me laugh to imagine is that Mark says Tim personally deleted his number off of Mark's phone. Even still, Mark is really concerned about Tim, even continually pleading with Gregg to call him again. But Gregg, on the other hand, clearly is in a mutually abusive relationship with Tim. In this special, Gregg is flustered the whole time, and it feels like answering Tim is a lifeline for him so he can get back to his comfort zone of butting heads with this man. On the few occasions that Gregg is left to host an episode of the main show without Tim, he barely talks about the movies he always pleads to make time for. Instead, he just talks about Tim. Side note, while editing this, I realized that the 7th episode of both season 8 and 9 feature Mark and Gregg debriefing about a different disaster that caused Tim to miss the episode, and Gregg's wearing the same shirt in both of them. I guess that's Gregg's lucky Tim fucked up shirt, but that's neither here nor there. In the season leading up to this special, when Tim burned down Gregg's storage unit, Gregg even cancels his precious Golden Age comedy segment to make time to talk about Tim. But later on in season 10, only when Tim is basically a hostage on his own show and Gregg has free reign, does he take the chance to do a whole episode of Popcorn Classics. It almost feels like his entire obsession is annoying Tim, rather than discussing movies for the sake of it. And if Tim's not there, it doesn't matter. Like he's weaponizing his personality against Tim rather than simply being himself. It's interesting that after all of this with Tim in this special, Gregg does seem to feel that it's over. He no longer knows what to do and seems really lost.
Might do a list of Charlton Heston Oscar nominations.
But it doesn't read as genuine concern for Tim, rather for how Tim's behavior has effectively deflated him, which I'd suspect was at least part of Tim's goal in all this. So with Tim maybe dead, there Gregg is, processing his feelings, looking defeated and scared, all alone in the dark, and showing us a video of an old Bond song performance from the Oscars on his laptop. This is a bizarre and brilliant example of Gregg Turkington's comedic power. It's simultaneously a hilarious and really unsettling moment, and a finale that Tim would absolutely have hated. It feels like Gregg, despite panic and regret, getting the last word on Tim. Except he doesn't, because brilliantly this special ends on a picture of the DKR logo, with everyone watching still uncertain of what had happened to Tim. I don't know the in-universe reason for why this would come up during Gregg's special, but in either case, I love how it represents their constant fight to get the last word in on each other. Anyway, because this is on cinema, the impact of the special doesn't end there. Because with the way they've set this universe up, there are so many different mediums to flesh out the story.
This is multimedia.
In the aftermath, the blame game started right up on cue. After the special aired, Tim tweeted out what he called a statement regarding the Our Cinema Oscar special debacle. Tim claims to have given Gregg, who he calls an occasional guest of On Cinema, a suitable amount of advanced technology to put on the special. This is a point Gregg started arguing before it was even made, baking into the special itself constant reminders that the shortcomings weren't his fault, but the fault of Tim not giving him enough money.
Not a lot of room here because Tim didn't give us the budget. The budget for this special is really low, but you can complain to Tim, not to me.
Tim also repeats the claim that he made on the show that Mark Proksch, spelled wrong of course, was not authorized to appear. I love that in this case, Tim is totally right about the issues with the event. It being a technological disaster, the mishmash of bad and boring thoughts about Humphrey Bogart. But to be fair, he also fails to mention that he called in and essentially pretended to kill himself. I'll never get tired of the way these two try to spin their own behavior and make the other look bad. Hey, and look, it's no wonder Giamotto took such an interest in Tim. He was preaching about the power of mercy all the way back in 2017. Gregg took the other angle, coping by tweeting things out like, nice to hear so many people saying the Our Cinema Oscar special was as good as the Oscars themselves. Thanks, everyone. The Our Cinema Oscar special is a real treasure of the purposely hard to watch, and it's actually one of my favorite pieces of this universe for that reason. It's a troll of sorts, but even at face value and on its own merits, I find it to be hilariously entertaining and one I come back to quite often. Partially because it's my favorite Mark content there is, even without him doing many of his signature impressions.
Charlie Chaplin's one of my all-time favorite guys to do.
I talk a lot about the continuity and context that compounds and makes everything in this universe funnier the more that you've seen and the more you understand. That's definitely true here, and it would take that to even want to understand what the hell is going on here. If this was the first thing I'd seen, I wonder how long I would have lasted. But at the same time, the interplay between Mark and Gregg especially makes it infinitely rewatchable for me, despite how unwatchable some of it is, if that makes sense. Hilariously, there are a lot of comments on this video complaining about the quality of it, as if that wasn't the point, and saying it was a complete miss. To be fair, I actually understand that perspective. I could see why even some hardcore On Cinema fans would rank this lower on their Oscar lists, as well as why this one has so many fewer views than the rest. Because after all, that's kind of the point. But the point of its existence aside, there's so much creative intention in its terribleness that really elevates it for me, and I just love it. That's why I think the first Our Cinema Oscar special is an underrated hidden gem of On Cinema that deserves another watch. See you at the 5th annual.
That was really great.